When we started to think about the relationship of democracy and war, also occasioned by this book project that was made possible by the award, there was a consensus among the students that democratic practices cannot be merely suspended and relegated to the post-war period. Rather than giving definite answers about what is democracy in war, discussions, for example, at the EUFU Winter School in 2024 January on state of emergency made it clear that the paradigms commonly used to navigate these problems in Western academia, often predicated upon an internal type of violence, so civil war basically, rather than full-scale war, are quite inadequate to describe the Ukrainian situation. There is very little experience actually in global thinking about how to have democracy in war, because usually you have total war doesn't really coexist with democracy. From this discussion, other questions followed about the distribution of the burdens of war, even of the burdens of death in war, the internal dynamic of the Ukrainian public sphere, the tension between the imperative of national unity and the plurality of positions and opinions, and the possibility of political dissent and action in wartime. What is it possible to protest in a moment of a war, for example? These dilemmas brought together a group of EUFU students into an essay writing seminar led by our colleagues Tetiana Zemlyakova and Guillaume Armstrong. It aimed to engage with the major issues of Ukrainian society, faced from the perspective of the students who began their university studies not much before the Russian invasion. I mean, most of the students we work with were basically 19, 20, in 22 years. So you can imagine they came out of COVID and they went into the war. And who were hit by the experience of the full-scale war precisely when they started to formulate their academic interests. In this sense, it became impossible to separate the scholarly and existential dimensions of their engagement. When they talk about the war, they talk about themselves. When they talk about themselves, they have to talk about the war. As the situation is unprecedented, there are no guidelines to follow. Thus, all contributors had to find their way to a chosen theme by formulating new questions and in some cases developing a new conceptual language and new authorial positions to express their ideas. There is no easy lesson to draw from all this, and I cannot resume the gist of these complex and personal contributions in a couple of sentences. I hope you will have the chance to read it when it becomes available in, I think, a couple of weeks. What is important is agency. Democracy is not a given, but something that you have to reconfigure and critically sustain day by day. This is, I think, a consensus of all our students, and I hope it's relevant for this audience as well. It is only sustained by participation. Choosing to opt out, even if existentially and morally often understandable, eventually legitimizes those efforts that aim at eliminating the democratic institutions. Let me thank you for your attention, and let me symbolically hand over to you the book, Invisible University for Ukraine, Essays on Democracy and War. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, Cornell University Press is not ready with printing it, so we cannot show it as a physical copy, but I think the electronic copy will be very soon on their website. Instead, let me pass the word to one of the contributors, Natalia, who will address you in the name of the authors and of the EUFU student community living now in the United States, so she didn't have to fly over from Europe. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Balázs. And I think I will start by saying that I'm a student from Ukraine. I did not have a chance to receive my education in Ukraine, so I started first in Vienna, Central European University, and then shortly after I fled to the States, where I'm now getting a degree in history at Yale University. And I think I will start my speech by reflecting on the book that was mentioned several times today already, Democracy at War, and it's not called so accidentally. So I believe that the strength of this book comes from its deeply personal perspective, so the lived experiences of the people who were caught in the war, and they were pushed to take a choice to engage in the war, and in the war for individuality, freedom, and freedom play, even though they didn't really have this choice whether to engage in it or not. In times like this, you seek ways to reflect on the daily realities that consume your life, and you try to make sense of the nonsensical through it. And I believe that the process of writing this book was an act of democracy itself. Through storytelling, through creating and reflection together, we arrived at a powerful understanding. While writing this book, we found space to disagree on interpretations of democracy and freedom, yet still respect each other's views. In the end, we created a story that, while diverse, is united by a shared commitment to what we all value deeply. We also understand that the questions Ukrainian scholars are posing are not limited just to Ukrainian audience, and probably might be relevant for the non-Ukrainian community as well. Democratic life per se in Ukraine may be constrained by the war, but it is far from being in ruins or destroyed. It's upheld by the civic actors in Ukraine, by the armed forces of Ukraine, by the people who volunteer and who try to reintegrate veterans back into their civilian life and push for the ongoing research and civic engagement. These are the people whom I feel we have to first acknowledge when we say how democracy is now upheld in Ukraine during the full-scale war started by Russia. But we also have to acknowledge the international solidarity that enables this work on a consistent and normative level. The people applauding Ukrainian democracy during the war are spread across Europe, United States, and in Ukraine right now, actively working toward this goal. They're volunteering, monitoring institutions, and producing analytical work on the phenomena, really, of the social cohesion right now that appears in Ukraine. Many of them are fighting in the armed forces of Ukraine, including Alexei Rudenko, whom you didn't have a chance to meet today or see a video today, exactly because he had to reduce or minimize his academic involvement to fight and uphold the democratic values that are central to the Western world. The choices we make as academics, thus, whether to support a Ukrainian educational initiative, to shop for elections, or how to shape discussions about Ukraine and the space that we give to these discussions, these choices influence the future of Ukraine's fight to preserve democracy. And I believe that the fight that Ukraine is now leading, in turn, is also a defense of democratic values that are central to the so-called Western world. And in this sense, our decisions are very deeply interconnected. Ukraine isn't the only nation defending democracy under the threat of the rise of authoritarianism right now. Today, the world recognizes that if Ukraine falls, Russia will then turn to Baltic countries, then to Poland, then to Georgia, and probably the rest of the world. And the economic and political implications will affect the whole world. Just as Ukraine's success is crucial for the future of global democracy, this war trajectory depends on the choices of its allies, especially the United States. Decisions like those in the upcoming elections will determine not only the near-term democratic trajectory of the United States, but will also determine whether the horrors of the forced deportations, identity erasure, and filtration camps can be stopped in Ukraine, or on the contrary, will be allowed to spread further in Europe and beyond. While being in the United States, I opt to hear pessimistic predictions of what the future holds. And I think it is tempting to say that democracy is in decline, but each new challenge only amplifies our responsibility to act. My dear friend and colleague Olga Stasov, whom you saw she was the second one given a short video introduction, also contributed to this book. She demonstrates this commitment in her active work, volunteering work for the armed forces of Ukraine. And when I recently asked her anxiously, Olga, what should we do? How should we proceed? Because Russian troops are now only 13 miles from the Dnipropetrovsk region, which has never been occupied in this part of the war. She said, Natalia, this only means that there will be more wounded on that last stretch separating us from the loss of freedom, speech, and assembly. And that means that we have work to do to make sure they have the tactical medicine needed to survive. I think that her response holds a powerful lesson. Rather than becoming paralyzed by the big picture, we must focus on what is within our reach and taking personal and collective actions that matter. Thus, supporting Ukraine both military and in intellectual realms reinforces the commitment of safeguarding democratic identity, ensuring that both cultural continuity and resilience are part of our shared future. In academic terms, to support Ukraine, one needs to rethink how Ukrainian questions are approached in academic frameworks. This means moving beyond the outdated labels like post-Soviet and rethinking departments and curricula and actively incorporating Ukrainian scholars' perspectives. Rethinking the titles of the programs is just the beginning. We have to move further for the deeper and lasting changes, such as long-term funding for Ukrainian studies programs, tenured positions for Ukrainian scholars, and scholarships for Ukrainian students. These are essential efforts. Supporting Ukraine's defense on both the battlefield and in intellectual spaces reinforces the idea that fighting for democracy requires a multifaceted commitment. While we all strive for a victorious peace, so-called, defending academic freedom during the war becomes even more crucial. Ukraine's academic community faces a fight for survival. Universities and research institutions have been destroyed. Archives, museums, and libraries are evacuated or lost to fires. And daily work is now disrupted by the air raid alarms, missiles, and drone strikes. The role of knowledge-making now reaches beyond its conceptual goal of teaching and learning. Studying humanities or social sciences or even STEM majors is now becomes applicable and intertwined in applying these new insights to the urgent challenges like troubled Ukrainian cities or protecting human rights of civilians and soldiers. These issues, along with the natural academic curiosity, are what Ukrainian students bring to the virtual classroom every day. The invisible university for Ukraine itself embodies both a response to preserve democracy and a sort of a practical training ground for democratic principles. Responsibility, after all, comes from the word response. Responsibility from intellectual engagement comes with the ability to respond. And in these times, where darkness, evil, and hope all collide, this response must drive meaningful change in academia and beyond. Thank you again for your time, and Slava Ukraini.